Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, Game Freak's 2022 mainline Pokémon games, had infamously poor visuals. Rudimentary lighting, low-res textures, and stiff animation afflicted these open-world efforts. Plus, the game suffered from near-constant drops beneath their 30 FPS targets, had low rendering resolutions with constant aliasing, and used crudely decimated animation for objects more than a few meters from the player. Technically, they were a failure by any reasonable standard. But those games were designed to run on dated original Switch hardware, which shouldered part of the graphical blame. The Switch 2 offers considerably greater specs, and conveniently, this pair of titles has received a Switch 2 update to enable better visuals. So what should prospective Switch 2 players expect out of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet on Nintendo's new console? The largest visual difference in Scarlet and Violet on Switch 2 lies in image quality. The original game ran between 720p and 1080p in docked mode and about 576p to 720p portably, without anti-aliasing treatment of any kind. That wouldn't be too offensive looking necessarily for a game with a relatively small scale. But of course Violet, which is the actual version of these games that I'm playing today, though all my findings should apply to Scarlet as well, is an open world title, creating vast views with plenty of ultra-fine details to resolve. This updated version of Violet has clean, temporally treated visuals in comparison, with a vastly more stable rendition of its world. The game looks genuinely quite solid now in image quality terms, and holds up well on a 4K television set. Shimmering is mostly a thing of the past, and aliasing artifacts are generally absent, especially in still shots. The resolution setup here is a bit interesting. We're getting a 1080p internal resolution in docked play without signs of DRS, which is a somewhat modest upgrade over its last-gen counterpart. It's the image treatment, though, that impresses. It's slightly soft on a 4K TV, but it otherwise provides a good-looking image. I suspect we're seeing a utilization of one of NVIDIA's DLSS technologies on Switch 2 here. In part, that comes down to certain shared image quality characteristics with other confirmed or suspected Switch 2 titles that use DLSS. There's a fair amount of image breakup on moving objects, for instance, revealing crisp, untreated edges, and long accumulation trails can be spotted on distant moving objects. It's not good at creating an effectively anti-aliased image in some of these more difficult scenarios. I think this falls more in line with the DLSS variants used in games like Fast Fusion and Hogwarts Legacy, which exhibit more image breakup than we're used to seeing with PC DLSS. We don't have firm confirmation of what the various DLSS presets do on Switch 2, but early indications suggest there may be higher and lower quality DLSS variants that are available to developers. And this could be one of the cheaper versions. Portable mode runs at about 648p internally on average, though there does seem to be some DRS here, and it delivers a pretty sharp and clean 1080p-like final image on the Switch 2 screen. Again, even though the internal resolution isn't a great deal better than Switch 1, the actual delivered image quality is far, far better. Compared to the Switch 2 docked mode, expect to see a similar visual presentation in stills, but more breakup in motion. Docked mode does look a bit sharper and more detailed, though compression artifacts on the portable mode screen captures do slightly obscure the image quality delta between the two. The other obvious visual improvement comes down to framerate. Violet's Switch 1 incarnation was an infamously poor performer, often hanging in the mid-20s during open-world exploration. Cutscenes often ran even worse, and the game would occasionally hang with a long frame time spike. I've seen worse performers on Switch, but the combination of crude visuals and poor frame rates in a Switch-exclusive game was exceptional. Switch 2 is a huge improvement in docked mode, aiming for and usually hitting a 60 FPS framerate target. There are relatively frequent dropped frames while traversing the open world though, little 33 millisecond blips that pop up when traveling through certain areas. This is obviously far preferable to the original Switch's performance profile, but it's a little bit disappointing that the deployment of the advanced T239 processor can't bring the game to a solid 60. There are occasional dips elsewhere as well, like with certain combat moves in battle. In handheld mode, you can expect a similar update, which counts to around 60 FPS in my off-screen testing with high framerate filmed footage. You can still feel small frame time spikes as you drive around the environment, but it's generally fine. The game's animation update rates have also been greatly improved. On Switch 1, distant characters and objects often ran with heavily decimated animation. A good example is this windmill, which updated approximately 2 times per second at this distance. Getting closer gradually increased the update rate, though the structure only updated at full rate with the rest of the game once you were very close, only a few meters away. Characters were badly affected as well, producing some pretty incredible results like this classroom of 5 update per second students. Switch 2 appears to be completely liberated from this issue. At any distance, you will see full update animation it seems. The animation and position of these students walking down the stairs finally aligns, for instance, and the students here no longer distract as much. The classroom students also get a full rate update, greatly improving the fidelity of this narrative sequence. And the infamous windmill also runs at full rate, even at a far distance. This is a huge improvement that likely depends on the Switch 2's greatly upgraded CPU hardware. More Pokémon also tend to spawn in. When we walk or drive through identical routes in the game on Switch 1 and Switch 2, typically we find more Pokémon on the Switch 2 version. This is hard to nail down precisely as there is some probabilistic variance, but there is a definite pattern here, and I do have to take more evasive action to avoid Pokémon battles on Switch 2. Finally, loading times are much faster. Fast traveling around the world took a fair bit of time on Switch 1, but in Switch 2, we get up to a 4.4 times speed up, with travel loads lasting just a few seconds. Loading times in general seem greatly improved on Nintendo's new console. There are a lot of elements, however, that haven't been upgraded for Switch 2. Draw distances are generally the same across both platforms, for instance. Pop-in for characters, Pokémon, and bits of environmental geometry appear identical or at least very similar on Switch 1 and Switch 2. There are some exceptions though, where Pokémon on Switch remained culled unusually close to the player, and these moments don't seem to occur on Switch 2. The pop-in is a lot easier to spot typically now that image shimmering no longer distracts, and the game's effective pixel count has been raised. Some of the apparent draw distance glitches have been preserved on Switch 2 as well, like how the student and her dog are called oddly as we traverse back and forth here. It's not quite as bad as before, but it's still obvious. Pokémon still aren't persistent after they leave a certain radius from the player. Once a Pokémon pops out of view, don't expect to see them again necessarily once you move closer. This lack of persistence does annoy somewhat, and doesn't really match player expectations for open world gaming. Shadow resolution also appears roughly the same as before. Expect to see very low-res shadow maps throughout the game, with a blobby aliased appearance. Shadow filtering does appear slightly different, however, and arguably looks a touch more refined, with slightly less obvious edges. Texture resolutions also appear unchanged. Up close, expect to see the same low-quality textures with crude normal maps that we saw before. Also expect similar issues with texture tiling at a distance. Of course, distant textures resolve with higher resolution bitmaps, so there's greater texture detail at a distance, even if the base asset is identical. Texture filtering remains pretty poor though, with a muddy resolve on the street on both platforms. Pokémon Violet also makes use of still full-screen images occasionally during cutscenes, presumably to avoid scene changes. These images appear aliased and low resolution, just like their Switch 1 counterparts, and don't seem to be updated at all for Switch 2. The game also occasionally uses pre-rendered videos, which again are unchanged. Pokémon Violet doesn't support HDR at all either, unless you want to force it on for all software in the system settings. I think this is pretty much fine, given that the game wasn't authored with HDR in mind to begin with. Finally, the game's underlying visual techniques are unchanged. There's no SSAO here, indirect lighting quality is poor, animations are stiff and awkward, and models appear basic and low fidelity. There are a few nice touches, like the Zelda-style grass, but the game generally resembles an early 360 or PS3 title. The original Switch wasn't the most powerful hardware around by any means, but it could still pull off visually impressive and artistically sound open-world efforts that ran at reasonable frame rates. Game Freak's graphics techniques and engine technology haven't really kept pace with the transition to HD consoles. The engine used for these mainline Pokémon titles does not seem well suited to delivering a credible open-world game with modern fidelity, given its current gameplay and graphical limitations in the Pokémon games. The Switch 2 offers enough power to blast past some of the game's technical issues on the original Switch unit, however. Image quality and framerate concerns have largely been ameliorated by the faster hardware, producing a decent rendition of Scarlet and Violet. There's no doubt that it's a huge visual upgrade, though it's arguably not enough to produce a visually satisfying version of the game. So Scarlet and Violet are massively enhanced on Switch 2, even if the visuals are still uninspiring. Pokémon fans would be well advised to check this one out. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch use social media. Thanks for watching.